Hi, my name's Greg from TP Photography, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about my use of the Sony A7 cameras for weddings, portraits and lots of other commercial work. So my history is I used to use Canon for many years, then I slowly moved over to Nikon, and now I'm sort of slowly moving over to Sony as well. I find that where I don't need the fast frame rates of the big pro bodies, then the Sony fits quite well. So I get about 5 frames a second from the Sonys, which is more than fast enough for weddings. I quite like the fact that they're lighter, the lenses are lighter. I can also put on Canon lenses, I can put on Nikon lenses, I can put on old vintage lenses, so I get a big wide choice of lenses. So it's almost like a universal mount really for cameras and lenses. Now lots of people say about the battery life. I've not really found that so much of a problem because I easily get sort of over 1,000 shots on the batteries, which, you know, maybe I have to change it once during a wedding. It depends how many pictures I take, but often I'll not have to change them at all. So I'm shooting with a couple of bodies, typically either A7S and A7R Mark II, or sometimes I'll use the A7 Mark II as well. All really good bodies. The focusing's pretty good. Certainly, you know, on a par with DSLRs. A lot of people will say it's not as good, but I don't really find any problems with that at all. You know, we're not talking about chasing people running around a sports field here. You know, certainly sort of weddings, portraits, commercial work, it's more than up for that sort of work. So I'm going to take you through what lenses I have for my Sonys, and which ones I use most, which ones work best for me. You know, which ones, if I was starting to build up a new system, which ones I'd choose first, and that sort of thing. So first up we have the Sony FE55 1.8. That's a brilliant lens. It's got a little Zeiss badge on there, although I think it's made by Sony. It's a great portrait lens. I actually use it a lot more than I do my 50mm on the Canon Nikons that I used. It's just a little bit more of a reach than the 50mm, so it's a good portrait length as well. So you can, you know, if you're tight for space, you can use it for portraits. It's just a good general all-round lens. You know, people do say it's quite expensive for a 1.8 prime, but you know, the quality is there, and you know, it's worth getting a good quality lens as opposed to paying a little bit less for a you know, all the other 1.8s that you find from other systems. Although they might be optically good, the build quality is certainly not quite up to the standard of this 55mm from Sony. So that'd probably be the first one I'd suggest people get. Another one I recommend is the Sony FE28 f2 lens. Now there's a couple of reasons for that. It's a little bit wider than the 35mm, and I find that the 28mm is a good focal length. It gives you a little bit of extra width, but without the distortion of the 24mm. The other advantage is that the Sony 28mm also lets you put on a couple of adapters. So you can put on an adapter to give you 21mm, and then that turns it into a 21 f2.8. So you get that extra width, and then I've used that a few times where I need a bit of extra width, but I don't need necessarily an ultra wide angle lens. So you still get autofocus with that. The quality is pretty good. If you want to, you can also get a fisheye adapter, and I've not really bothered with that because I'm not a massive fisheye user. I do have a fisheye lens for my Nikon cameras, which I can sort of use if I really wanted to do that. So the 28mm, very good lens. It's quite light as well, so it's quite tiny. So if you have a 28mm and a 55mm, then you've got a good sort of wide and a sort of mid-telly to normal lens there. So that's like a good combination. Now the next sort of lens that a lot of people would want to buy would be like an 85mm. Now Sony don't sell an 85mm themselves. They only sell a 90mm macro, which when I first moved to Canon Nikon, then I used the 90mm quite a lot because it's a good focal length for portraits, and it also doubles as details and macro. So the 90mm is a great choice. Now Zeiss also have a 85mm Batis lens, 1.8, and that gets rave reviews, but unfortunately it's really hard to get hold of. It's a little bit more expensive than the Sony, but you do have the 1.8 versus the 2.8, So if you want to do portraits and you really like the 85mm, then that's a good option for you to use. So I was originally waiting for the Batis 85mm, because that was actually announced before the Sony 90mm macro, but as it turned out, the macro became available sooner. Now, I use the macros from Canon and Nikon quite a lot anyway, and it's actually quite, as I said before, it's a really good portrait lens. So it doubles as a brilliant portrait lens, and it also doubles as a details lens. So for the time being, the 90mm 2.8 is what I'd recommend to people. A bit bigger and heavier than the 85mm are, but you know, the optical quality is brilliant. It lets you capture the little details, so very useful for weddings, good for portraits where you want to get like a really tight shot that you can never get with those 85mm lenses because it just won't focus close enough. So that's always one of my recommendations. So I'd say if you want a basic kit, then go for the 28mm and 55mm. If you want to be doing a bit more portraits and some details, things like that, then add the 90mm 2.8. And if you want a good sort of longer portrait lens, then the only option at the moment is the Sony 7200 f4. Now, f4, a lot of people don't like the sound of that. They're used to their 2.8s, but these days with the high ISO as it is in cameras, then I'll take the f4 and the lighter weight. Thank you very much at the moment. So that works really well. Optically brilliant. In fact, often the f4 versions are better than the 2.8 versions because of the less complex design that they have to do. So, you know, if you want something a bit longer, then the 7200 f4 is good. Bear in mind it's f4, but I always find that if f4 is not fast enough, then that extra stop of 2.8 isn't really going to cut it. So I'd be looking at, you know, an f2 lens or faster anyway. So if I find that there's no 2.8 Sony, then I'd probably be looking at sort of an f2 type lens anyway. So, you know, for me that's not really a problem, and that's the way I went with both my Canon when I was shooting Canon and my Nikon kit, in that I never really used the 7200 2.8s once I got used to using primes, because the primes give me the lighter weight and sometimes the faster aperture as well where I need it. So I think the only thing really missing from the system would be an 85 1.8 from Sony, or the Zeiss Batis lenses actually becoming, you know, available to purchase without having to wait 6 months and then hoping you arrive and get it and all that sort of stuff. So that's my sort of brief overview. Now, obviously, the brilliant thing about the A7R Mark II is that it will also take adapted lenses with much better autofocus. Now, I've been using the A7S and the A7 Mark II and adapted lenses there, so I've got a whole slew of Canon FD lenses because you can pick those up pretty cheap on eBay. Optically, they're actually surprisingly good. In fact, the less elements in them compared to modern lenses means you actually get sort of a lovely rendering. So, you know, it might not be necessarily 100% as sharp as the modern lenses, you know, and corrected for all the chromatic aberrations, blah, blah, blah. But actually, you know, the actual rendering and the feel of the lens and the way it looks is really good, and it has the advantage that the manual focus on them is, you know, as it was designed for manual focus, is actually really good. So you end up with some cracking pictures, and for a lot of things, you know, in the same way as people used to be able to use autofocus, the beauty of the mirrorless cameras is that it actually makes it really easy to do manual focus, because you've got the focus peaking, you've got the magnification, and a lot of the time then, you know, people aren't actually moving that fast. So, you know, if I take a typical wedding, for example, then if the bride and groom are standing at the altar, then, you know, they're standing at the altar and not really moving that much. So, you know, often in that case, autofocus is a bit of a liability in that, you know, you might get some slight variation in the autofocus, whereas if you manually focus, then you know you're going to be sort of nailing the shots there. So, you know, that's not as much of a disadvantage as you might think, especially with the in-body stabilisation of the A7 II, A7R2 and things like that. Then, you know, you get image stabilising built in, which, you know, you wouldn't get otherwise. So, you know, it makes them a lot more usable than you'd think. So, you know, that's worth considering when you're looking at looking at these mirrorless cameras, and, you know, is it worth me switching or things like that. There's no doubt it is slightly a different way of working. You've got the EVF, which I actually absolutely love. You know, the fact that you can see the exposure before you take the picture. You know, so you don't have to worry about the metering, and then, you know, so you don't really chimp anywhere near as much, which means that you're less likely to miss moments that are happening. So, you know, my first year of mirrorless and Sony at weddings, you know, obviously I started shooting alongside my Nikon kit, and I haven't really looked back from there. You know, the lighter weight, you know, everything fits in a bag, you know, and it doesn't matter how fit you are, at the end of the day, if you're carrying less weight, then you're going to be more alert and more ready for things that are happening. So, you know, that's a benefit to your clients as well. Away from weddings, portraits in the studio, commercial work, then, you know, there's no real disadvantage to using these things in that environment. You know, the beauty of the Sony A7 line is that you've got a lower resolution, high sensitivity camera, you've got a high resolution version, you've got sort of medium resolution version, so you've got, you know, in the same bodies you've got different sensors. So, you know, whereas with Canon and Nikon you might have that mixed across different bodies, so you've got to get used to different controls and things, then you've got that commonality with the Sony setup. So, you know, that's another benefit of that from my point of view. Going back to battery life, people list that as one of the negatives, and, you know, there's no doubt the battery life isn't as good as a DSLR. You know, you can leave your DSLRs on typically all day, you know, easily last, you know, the whole day without worrying about it. You know, you'd have to be a little bit more careful with the Sonys. You've got to sort of, I typically turn it off when I know I'm not going to take another picture with it for a while, you know, but once you've sort of trained your brain into doing that, then it doesn't become a big deal. You know, it's just different. So, you know, in the same way as if you move from Canon to Nikon or Nikon to Canon, you know, there's various things that are different. Doesn't mean they're any better or any worse. So that's just a personal preference there, really. So I think that sums up quite nicely sort of my feelings about the A7 series, and how I think it's, you know, perfectly capable of being used at weddings, events, things like that. So if you have any thoughts or comments, then leave them in the box below, and thanks for watching.